There are people in this world who run the moment love becomes real. The closer you get, the further they pull away. Not because they don't feel something, but because they feel too much. And most people misunderstand this completely. They think distance means disinterest. Silence means rejection. Cold behavior means the connection is dead. But sometimes the people who act the most detached are the ones fighting the hardest emotional battle inside themselves. Because when someone has spent years protecting their heart, avoiding vulnerability becomes survival. They learned to disconnect before they could be hurt. They mastered independence because dependence once brought pain. And when real love enters their life, it shakes every emotional wall they spent years building. That's why your energy changed everything. You stopped chasing validation. You stopped begging for attention. You stopped trying to force connection. And the moment you became emotionally grounded, something shifted inside them. Because emotionally avoidant people are not moved by pressure. They are moved by safety. Most people overwhelm them with expectations, demands, emotional chaos, and constant neediness. But you became different. You carried strength without control, presence without pressure, love without desperation, and that kind of energy is rare. You see, human beings are mirrors. People don't simply respond to your words, they respond to your emotional state. If you are anxious, fearful, and attached to outcomes, others feel it. But when you stand firmly in your own purpose, your own peace, your own identity, your energy becomes magnetic. That's what happened here. You became emotionally strong enough to let love breathe. You gave space without punishment. You listened without trying to fix. You understood their silence without turning it into a war. And for the first time in a long time, they felt seen instead of controlled. That terrified them, because when someone who avoids intimacy suddenly feels emotionally safe, their heart begins to open against their own conditioning, and that creates internal conflict. Part of them wants to run. Another part wants to stay forever. That's why avoidant people often appear confused. One day they pull close. The next day they disappear. One moment they crave connection. The next they shut down emotionally. But beneath all of that inconsistency is fear. Fear of losing freedom. Fear of being consumed. Fear of trusting the wrong person again. Fear that if they truly open up, they might lose themselves completely. And your power came from understanding something most people never learn. Love cannot grow where pressure exists. The strongest relationships are not built through force. They are built through emotional safety, respect, and freedom. You stopped trying to win love. You became love. That changed everything. Because when a person sees someone who is calm under pressure, emotionally mature during conflict, and deeply connected to purpose, they begin to feel something rare: trust. And trust is the language avoidant hearts understand. Not manipulation, not emotional games, not ultimatums, trust. You showed them that connection doesn't have to mean losing themselves. You proved that closeness can feel peaceful instead of overwhelming. You demonstrated that real love honors individuality instead of destroying it. That's why they can't stop thinking about you, not because you chase them, because you awakened something inside them they thought no longer existed. Hope, and understand this deeply. The most attractive quality on earth is emotional certainty. When you know who you are, when your happiness is not dependent on another person's behavior, when your soul is anchored in purpose, people feel it instantly. Confidence is not loud. Confidence is calm. It's the ability to remain centered even when emotions become intense. It's the ability to love someone deeply without abandoning yourself in the process. That energy transforms relationships because avoidant people expect emotional chaos. They expect guilt, pressure, drama, and emotional dependency. But when they encounter emotional strength mixed with compassion, it disarms them completely. Your patience became healing. Your boundaries became attractive. Your peace became addictive. And slowly, without even realizing it, they started falling in love with the way you made them feel around themselves. That is real connection, not obsession, not possession. Transformation. See, most people think love is about finding someone perfect. But real love is about becoming emotionally free enough to create safety for another human being while remaining true to yourself. That is rare power. And when you operate from that level, you stop attracting temporary attention. You start awakening deep emotional devotion, because emotionally avoidant people spend their whole lives waiting for someone who doesn't make love feel dangerous, someone who understands silence without taking it personally, someone who respects boundaries without withdrawing love, someone who remains emotionally steady when things get hard. You became that person. But here's the deeper truth. This journey was never only about them. It was about you becoming stronger, wiser, and more emotionally aligned with your own purpose. Because the moment you stop abandoning yourself for love, love begins to find you naturally. The moment you stop chasing people to fill emotional emptiness, you become powerful. And power rooted in peace is unstoppable. Never forget this. The right connection will not require you to betray your soul. Real love expands your spirit. It strengthens your purpose. It inspires growth. It creates freedom instead of fear. And when someone who spent years emotionally hiding finally feels safe enough to love openly because of your energy, that is one of the most powerful transformations a human being can experience. So continue becoming emotionally grounded, continue protecting your peace, continue choosing purpose over desperation, because the strongest relationships are not built by people who need each other to survive. They are built by two emotionally whole individuals who choose each other from a place of strength, truth, and deep inner alignment. And when you live from that place, you don't just attract love, you become unforgettable. Most people misunderstand emotionally avoidant individuals because they only judge what they can see on the surface. They see distance and assume there is no love. They see silence and assume there is no care. They see withdrawal and believe the connection means nothing. But the truth is far deeper than that. The emotionally avoidant person often feels emotions with overwhelming intensity. The problem is not the absence of love. The problem is the fear attached to it. You must understand this. People who avoid emotional closeness are usually protecting wounds that were created long before you arrived. Somewhere in their life, vulnerability became dangerous. Trust became painful. Depending on someone ended in disappointment, rejection, betrayal, or emotional suffocation. So they adapted. They learned to survive by disconnecting from deep emotional exposure. Independence became their armor. Emotional distance became their safety. But inside every avoidant person is a human being starving for connection. They want love. They crave intimacy. They dream about someone finally understanding them without overwhelming them. Yet the moment love becomes real, fear begins to rise inside them. Why? Because genuine connection threatens the emotional walls they spent years building. Love asks them to open doors they promised themselves would remain closed forever. That creates an internal battle most people never see. One part of them desperately wants closeness. Another part wants to run before they get hurt. This is why avoidants often appear inconsistent. They may pull close one day and become distant the next. They may deeply miss you while pretending they don't care. They may think about you constantly while struggling to express a single vulnerable emotion. The deeper their feelings become, the more intense their fear becomes. And that is why emotional safety matters more to them than emotional intensity. Most people try to force connection through pressure. They demand answers. They chase reassurance. They create emotional chaos hoping it will produce closeness. But pressure only activates the avoidant person's survival instincts. The more trapped they feel, the more they emotionally shut down. Safety changes everything. Emotional safety means they are allowed to exist without constant fear of judgment, control, or emotional invasion. It means they can slowly lower their guard without feeling forced. It means they can breathe around you instead of constantly defending themselves emotionally. This is why calm energy is so powerful. When you stop reacting emotionally to every moment of distance, you create stability. When you stop making their fear your personal rejection, you create understanding. When you allow space without withdrawing love or respect, you become different from the people who taught them that closeness leads to pain. And something remarkable begins to happen. They slowly start associating your presence with peace instead of pressure. That is rare for them. Most avoidants are used to relationships filled with emotional volatility. They expect criticism, demands, guilt, or disappointment. So when they encounter someone emotionally grounded, someone secure within themselves, their nervous system experiences something unfamiliar: safety. And safety is what allows love to grow, because real intimacy cannot exist where fear dominates. A guarded heart does not open because it is pushed. It opens because it feels protected enough to breathe. That is why patience matters. Not passive patience that tolerates disrespect, but emotionally mature patience rooted in self-respect and understanding. The kind of patience that says, I understand your fear, but I will not abandon myself trying to save you. That balance is powerful. Avoidants secretly admire emotional strength more than emotional dependence. They are drawn to people who have their own purpose, identity, and peace. Why? Because emotionally secure people do not make love feel like imprisonment. They make it feel safe. And deep down, that is what the avoidant person truly longs for. Not endless excitement, not dramatic emotional highs, peace. A connection where they can finally stop running. A person who understands that behind their silence is often fear, behind their distance is confusion, and behind their coldness is a heart terrified of being broken again. When someone provides that kind of emotional safety consistently, walls begin to crack. Slowly, carefully, almost invisibly at first, the avoidant person starts allowing themselves to feel what they spent years suppressing. Love, not the chaotic version built on attachment and fear, but the deeper kind built on trust, emotional freedom, and genuine understanding. And once they experience that kind of connection, it becomes unforgettable. Consistency is one of the rarest forms of emotional power in today's world. Most people are driven by moods, impulses, temporary emotions, and reactions. One day they are fully invested, the next day they disappear emotionally. One moment they promise forever, the next moment they become strangers. This emotional instability creates fear in relationships, especially for someone who already struggles with trust and vulnerability. For emotionally avoidant people, inconsistency feels dangerous because their entire emotional system is built around self-protection. They are constantly scanning for signs that closeness will eventually lead to pain. They expect disappointment before love even has the chance to fully grow. This is why emotional consistency becomes deeply attractive to them. It creates something their nervous system rarely experiences: predictability and safety. Most people think attraction is built through intensity. They believe emotional highs, dramatic passion, and constant excitement create strong bonds. But intensity without stability eventually creates exhaustion. Emotionally avoidant people especially become overwhelmed by relationships that feel emotionally chaotic. The moment connection begins to feel unstable or demanding, their instinct is to retreat. Consistency changes that dynamic completely. Consistency means your behavior does not constantly shift based on emotions. It means you remain grounded even when situations become uncertain. You communicate with honesty instead of manipulation. You show care without becoming controlling. You remain respectful even during difficult moments. That kind of energy calms the avoidant mind. Because emotionally avoidant individuals are used to relationships where affection feels conditional. Many of them grew up in environments where love was unpredictable. Sometimes they received warmth, other times rejection. Sometimes they were accepted, other times criticized or emotionally ignored. As a result, they learned not to fully trust emotional closeness. But when someone enters their life with steady energy, something powerful begins happening internally. Their defenses slowly lower, not because they are forced to change, but because your consistency starts challenging the painful beliefs they carry about relationships. Every time you remain emotionally mature instead of reactive, you create trust. Every time you respect boundaries instead of demanding control, you create trust. Every time you communicate calmly instead of creating drama, you create trust. And trust is everything to an avoidant person. Without trust, they will always keep one foot out the door emotionally. They may care deeply, but fear will continue controlling their actions. But consistency weakens fear over time because it proves that connection does not always end in emotional chaos. This process does not happen overnight. Emotionally avoidant people often test consistency without realizing they are doing it consciously. Sometimes they withdraw emotionally to see if your behavior changes. Sometimes they create distance because they are overwhelmed by closeness. Sometimes they become quiet because vulnerability feels uncomfortable. Most people react emotionally to this behavior. They become angry, anxious, controlling, or desperate for reassurance. But when you stay emotionally centered instead of reacting impulsively, you demonstrate strength, and strength creates emotional safety. Avoidants deeply respect people who can manage their emotions without becoming destructive. Why? Because emotionally stable people feel safe to attach to. They do not create emotional traps. They do not force intimacy through guilt or pressure. They allow connection to develop naturally. This is incredibly healing for someone who fears emotional engulfment. Your consistency also teaches them something important about love. Real connection is not built on perfection. It is built on reliability. You do not need to constantly impress someone emotionally to create deep attachment. You simply need to become someone whose presence feels emotionally safe, predictable, and peaceful. That is what emotionally avoidant people secretly crave, not control, not emotional pressure. Peace. A space where they can slowly express themselves without fear of immediate judgment or rejection. And when they encounter someone who consistently shows emotional maturity, patience, honesty, and self-respect, their perception of relationships begins to change. For perhaps the first time in their life, love no longer feels like a threat to their freedom or identity. It begins to feel like home. This is why consistency has transformative power. Anyone can create temporary attraction through charm, intensity, or excitement. But very few people can create emotional trust, and trust is what opens guarded hearts. The avoidant person may not immediately express how deeply they are affected by your steadiness. In fact, they may struggle to verbalize it at all. But internally, they begin depending on the emotional peace your presence provides. Your calm becomes comforting, your emotional stability becomes grounding, your reliability becomes rare. And over time, the very thing they once feared, emotional closeness, slowly becomes the thing they desire most. Because with you, closeness no longer feels unsafe, it feels secure. And that changes everything. There is something incredibly powerful about a person who knows their worth without needing constant validation from others. In a world filled with emotional chasing, desperation, and approval-seeking behavior, true confidence stands out immediately. Not loud confidence, not arrogance, not ego, but calm, grounded certainty within oneself. And for emotionally avoidant people, this kind of confidence becomes magnetic. Why? Because avoidants are highly sensitive to emotional pressure. The moment they feel someone becoming emotionally dependent on them for happiness, validation, or identity, fear begins rising inside them. They start feeling trapped, responsible, or overwhelmed. Even if they genuinely care, emotional neediness activates their instinct to pull away. This is why confidence without neediness changes everything. When you are emotionally secure within yourself, your energy becomes peaceful instead of demanding. You stop trying to force people to choose you because you already know your value. You stop begging for reassurance because your self-worth is not dependent on another person's behavior. You stop collapsing emotionally every time someone becomes distant because your identity is rooted in something deeper than temporary emotional reactions. That level of emotional independence is rare. Most people enter relationships hoping the other person will complete them emotionally. They search for someone to remove loneliness, insecurity, fear, or emptiness. But relationships built from emotional emptiness often become heavy. One person slowly becomes responsible for carrying the emotional stability of the other. Avoidant people feel this pressure immediately. Even if unspoken, they sense when someone needs them too much emotionally. And instead of feeling closer, they begin retreating internally because deep down they fear losing their freedom, their space, or themselves inside the relationship. But confidence creates a completely different experience. Confidence says, I deeply value this connection, but I also value myself. That energy feels safe. When you have your own purpose, your own passions, your own emotional stability, and your own direction in life, you stop approaching love from desperation. You approach it from abundance. You choose connection because it adds beauty to your life, not because you are emotionally incapable of standing alone. This kind of self-respect naturally creates attraction. Emotionally avoidant people admire strength because strength reduces pressure. They feel more comfortable opening up around someone who is emotionally grounded rather than emotionally dependent. A secure person does not panic every time space is needed. They do not turn every emotional shift into conflict. They do not demand constant proof of love to feel worthy, and that calmness allows the avoidant person to breathe emotionally. One of the greatest mistakes people make in relationships is abandoning themselves while trying to hold on to someone else. They sacrifice boundaries, self-respect, emotional balance, and even their purpose just to avoid losing connection. But the more someone abandons themselves, the more unstable the relationship becomes. True confidence does the opposite. It keeps you connected to yourself while remaining open to love. And this balance is deeply attractive because it communicates emotional maturity. Avoidants often expect relationships to become emotionally overwhelming. They expect demands, guilt, pressure, or emotional chaos. But when they encounter someone who remains emotionally steady, someone who respects themselves enough not to chase endlessly or lose control emotionally, it challenges their entire understanding of intimacy. They begin realizing that love does not always have to feel suffocating. This creates emotional curiosity inside them. Because your confidence gives them something they secretly crave, freedom within connection. You are not trying to control them. You are not making them responsible for your emotional survival. You are simply showing up authentically, confidently, and peacefully. That energy becomes unforgettable. Confidence without neediness also creates emotional mystery. When someone knows you value yourself deeply, they naturally become more curious about you. Why? Because self-respect communicates abundance. It signals that your life has meaning beyond the relationship itself. Purpose is attractive. Peace is attractive. Emotional control is attractive. And avoidants especially notice people who remain calm under emotional pressure because they are used to relationships driven by anxiety and emotional instability. Your grounded nature becomes a source of comfort to them, not because you are perfect, but because you are emotionally responsible for yourself. That is rare. And here is the deeper truth. Emotionally secure people create healthier love because they do not seek relationships to escape themselves. They enter relationships already connected to who they are. This allows them to love freely instead of fearfully. Fear says, don't leave me. Confidence says, I value this connection deeply, but I will still remain whole no matter what happens. That energy transforms relationships because people are naturally drawn toward those who radiate inner stability, especially avoidant individuals who have spent their lives fearing emotional chaos. Your confidence becomes proof that intimacy does not have to destroy peace. It can actually strengthen it. And when an avoidant person finally experiences connection with someone who loves deeply without losing themselves, it awakens something powerful inside them: respect, trust, and eventually a level of emotional attraction far deeper than temporary passion, because deep down, everyone longs for a love that feels free, safe, and emotionally steady. And confidence without neediness creates exactly that. One of the deepest human desires is to feel understood without having to constantly explain yourself. Not judged, not fixed, not controlled, simply understood. And for emotionally avoidant people, this desire runs even deeper because so much of their life has been spent hiding emotions they never felt safe expressing openly. Most avoidant individuals are misunderstood by almost everyone around them. People often label them as cold, detached, selfish, or emotionally unavailable without ever asking what created those walls in the first place. Very few people pause long enough to understand that emotional distance is often a defense mechanism, not a lack of feeling. This is why deep understanding without pressure becomes transformational. When someone feels emotionally overwhelmed, their instinct is usually not to move closer, it is to protect themselves. Avoidants especially react strongly to emotional force. The more they feel pushed to open up, commit, explain themselves, or process emotions before they are ready, the more their nervous system enters defense mode. Pressure makes them retreat. Understanding makes them soften. There is incredible power in giving someone emotional space without making them feel abandoned or guilty for needing it. That kind of emotional maturity creates safety. It communicates, I am here, but I am not here to control you. That energy changes everything. Most people confuse love with emotional intensity. They believe constantly demanding reassurance, answers, or closeness proves emotional investment. But true emotional intelligence understands timing. It understands that healing and trust cannot be forced, especially with avoidant personalities. Avoidants are often carrying years of emotional conditioning. Many learned early in life that vulnerability leads to pain, disappointment, rejection, or emotional suffocation. So they adapted by becoming hyper-independent. They learned to suppress emotions instead of expressing them. They became experts at surviving emotionally alone. But surviving is not the same as living deep down. They still crave connection like everyone else. They still want someone who sees beyond the walls. Someone patient enough to understand that silence is not always rejection, and distance is not always disinterest. And when you become that person, something powerful begins happening inside them. For perhaps the first time, they stop feeling emotionally hunted. That matters more than most people realize. Many avoidants spend relationships feeling pressured to become emotionally vulnerable on someone else's timeline. They feel criticized for needing space. They feel misunderstood for processing emotions slowly. And eventually they associate relationships with emotional exhaustion instead of emotional peace. But understanding creates a completely different emotional experience. Understanding means you listen without immediately reacting. You observe without assuming the worst. You allow emotions to unfold naturally instead of forcing immediate emotional exposure. This does not mean tolerating unhealthy behavior or abandoning your own needs. Real understanding still includes self-respect and healthy boundaries. But it means you stop interpreting every emotional struggle as a personal attack against you. That emotional maturity creates calmness inside the relationship. And calmness is healing. Avoidants are deeply affected by people who can remain emotionally steady without becoming controlling. Why? Because emotionally safe people give them room to breathe while still maintaining connection. This balance allows trust to develop slowly and naturally. Trust is everything to an avoidant person. Without trust, they will always hide emotionally. But understanding creates trust because it removes fear of judgment. Imagine how powerful it feels for someone who spent years emotionally guarded to finally meet a person who does not immediately punish them for struggling emotionally. Someone who sees their fear without labeling them broken. Someone who understands that healing takes time. That kind of compassion reaches places inside them that pressure never could, because people open up when they feel safe, not when they feel cornered. This is why emotional patience is so transformative. You stop trying to control outcomes and instead focus on creating emotional safety through your presence. Your calmness becomes reassuring. Your non-reactive energy becomes comforting. Your ability to understand without forcing becomes deeply attractive. And slowly, their walls begin lowering, not because they are weak, but because your energy no longer feels dangerous. That is rare for them. Most avoidants expect relationships to eventually become emotionally demanding or overwhelming. They expect disappointment, they expect judgment, they expect conflict. But when they encounter someone who approaches them with understanding instead of pressure, it changes their emotional reality. For the first time, intimacy begins feeling peaceful instead of threatening. And this creates emotional attachment at a much deeper level than temporary attraction ever could, because attraction may create excitement, but understanding creates emotional safety. And emotional safety creates lasting connection. People never forget the person who made them feel emotionally accepted while they were still learning how to trust. They never forget the person who saw their hidden fears and responded with patience instead of pressure. That kind of love reaches the soul. And for an avoidant person who spent years protecting themselves from emotional pain, being deeply understood without feeling controlled can become one of the most life-changing experiences they ever encounter. There is a powerful difference between loving someone and losing yourself trying to keep them. Many people enter relationships believing sacrifice means abandoning their own boundaries, tolerating emotional confusion, or accepting behavior that slowly destroys their peace. They think unconditional love means endless availability, endless patience, and endless emotional self-betrayal. But real love was never meant to cost you your identity. This is why self-respect and boundaries become deeply attractive, especially to emotionally avoidant people. Most avoidants are terrified of feeling emotionally trapped. They fear relationships where individuality disappears and emotional pressure takes over everything. They fear losing their freedom, their space, and their sense of control over their own lives. Even when they genuinely care about someone, the moment a relationship begins feeling emotionally consuming, their instinct is often to pull away. But healthy boundaries create something different. Boundaries communicate emotional stability. They show that you are capable of love without emotional dependency. They show that your happiness, identity, and self-worth do not completely collapse based on another person's behavior. That kind of emotional groundedness feels safe to avoidant individuals because it removes the fear of emotional suffocation. You see, emotionally avoidant people are often misunderstood as people who do not want connection. But in reality, most of them deeply want connection. They simply fear losing themselves inside it. They fear relationships where expectations become overwhelming, where emotional demands never end, and where personal freedom slowly disappears. That is why self-respect changes everything. When you maintain healthy boundaries, you demonstrate that love can exist alongside individuality. You show that closeness does not require control. You prove that emotional connection can still allow space, independence, and personal growth. This creates emotional safety. Most people think boundaries push others away. But healthy boundaries actually create stronger and more secure relationships because they remove resentment, emotional chaos, and unhealthy attachment patterns. Boundaries are not punishment. They are clarity. They communicate what you will and will not tolerate while still remaining respectful and emotionally mature. They allow love to grow in a healthy environment instead of one built on fear, guilt, or emotional imbalance. And avoidants secretly respect this more than most people realize. Why? Because emotionally avoidant individuals often admire people who can remain emotionally connected without becoming emotionally controlling. They are deeply drawn toward people who value themselves enough not to chase endlessly, beg for validation, or tolerate disrespect simply to keep a relationship alive. That kind of self-respect feels calm and trustworthy. It tells them, I want connection, but I also honor myself. This balance is incredibly powerful because it removes pressure from the relationship. It allows both people to exist as individuals instead of emotionally consuming each other. And this is where many relationships fail. One person slowly abandons themselves trying to secure love. They stop prioritizing their own growth, peace, and emotional health. Their entire emotional world begins revolving around the other person's attention and behavior. Over time, the relationship becomes emotionally heavy because one person is carrying unresolved fear, insecurity, and emotional dependence into every interaction. Avoidants feel overwhelmed by this quickly, not because they do not care, but because emotionally dependent energy makes love feel unsafe to them. It creates pressure. It creates responsibility they never asked for emotionally. And eventually they begin associating connection with exhaustion instead of peace. But boundaries prevent this dynamic from developing. When you maintain your own life, your own purpose, your own emotional balance, and your own standards, you create healthier love. You stop approaching relationships from desperation. You approach them from wholeness. This changes your energy completely. You no longer tolerate emotional inconsistency that destroys your peace. You no longer abandon your needs just to avoid losing someone. You no longer confuse emotional suffering with love. And strangely enough, this self-respect often increases attraction because emotionally healthy boundaries communicate confidence. They show emotional maturity. They show inner stability. And emotionally avoidant people feel safer around emotionally stable individuals because stability reduces fear. Think about it deeply. When someone knows you respect yourself, they know you are less likely to become emotionally controlling, manipulative, or dependent. They know your love comes from genuine choice rather than emotional emptiness. That creates trust. And trust allows avoidance to slowly relax emotionally. For perhaps the first time, they begin realizing that intimacy does not automatically mean losing freedom. They begin experiencing a relationship where space is respected instead of feared, where individuality is honored instead of threatened, where love exists without emotional imprisonment. That is deeply healing for them. And the beautiful truth is this: boundaries do not weaken love, they strengthen it. Because real love requires two emotionally whole individuals choosing connection freely, not two fearful people desperately trying to control each other to avoid abandonment. Self-respect protects your peace, boundaries protect your emotional health, and together they create the kind of stable, emotionally safe connection that allows even the most guarded hearts to slowly open, not through force, not through pressure, but through trust, freedom, and emotional security. Patience is one of the rarest forms of emotional strength in modern relationships. Most people want instant closeness, instant reassurance, instant certainty, and instant emotional results. The moment things become complicated, slow, or emotionally uncomfortable, they panic, they react impulsively, force conversations, create pressure, or walk away entirely. But emotionally avoidant people do not respond well to emotional force. They respond to emotional steadiness. This is why patience, emotional strength, and purpose become so transformative. An avoidant person is often carrying years of emotional conditioning that taught them vulnerability is unsafe. They learn to protect themselves by suppressing emotions, creating distance, and relying only on themselves. Even when they deeply care about someone, trust develops slowly because their nervous system constantly expects pain, disappointment, or emotional overwhelm. Most people misinterpret this process. They think love should always look immediate and obvious. They assume emotional hesitation means lack of interest. But avoidants often love quietly, cautiously, and internally long before they can fully express it externally. And this is where patience becomes powerful. Patience is not weakness, it is emotional control. It is the ability to remain calm without forcing outcomes. It is the ability to give connection room to grow naturally instead of trying to control every emotional moment. It is understanding that some hearts require safety before they can fully open. That kind of patience feels deeply healing to avoidant individuals because it removes fear. When someone pressures them emotionally, they feel trapped. But when someone remains emotionally grounded and patient, they begin feeling safe enough to slowly lower their defenses. And emotional strength is what allows patience to exist. Weakness reacts impulsively to fear. Strength remains centered. Emotionally strong people do not collapse every time they encounter uncertainty in relationships. They do not allow temporary emotional distance to destroy their identity or self-worth. They understand that another person's emotional struggle is not always a reflection of their value. That mindset creates peace. Avoidants are deeply affected by emotionally stable people because emotional stability feels safe. Most avoidants spent years protecting themselves from emotional chaos. They fear relationships becoming overwhelming, controlling, or emotionally draining. So when they encounter someone who remains calm under pressure, someone who does not react with desperation or emotional volatility, it changes how they experience connection. Your emotional strength becomes reassuring. Your calmness becomes comforting. Your patience becomes healing. And slowly, they begin trusting the connection more deeply. But patience alone is not enough. Purpose matters too. One of the most attractive qualities any person can possess is a life driven by meaning. Purpose creates emotional balance because your entire identity is not dependent on the relationship. You still have goals, passions, growth, discipline, and direction outside of love. This is incredibly important with avoidant individuals because purpose removes emotional pressure. When someone has no emotional center outside the relationship, connection becomes heavy. The relationship starts carrying unrealistic emotional responsibility. One person slowly becomes the source of happiness, identity, and stability for the other. Avoidants instinctively retreat from this because it feels emotionally suffocating. But purpose creates freedom. When you are connected to your own mission, growth, and inner peace, your love feels lighter. You are not clinging to the relationship for survival. You are sharing your life from a place of emotional wholeness. That energy is magnetic. Avoidants admire people who can love deeply without abandoning themselves. They respect individuals who remain connected to their own values, goals, and self-respect while still showing care and emotional warmth. Why? Because purpose-driven people feel emotionally safe. They do not create chaos every time uncertainty appears. They are not constantly demanding emotional reassurance to feel okay internally. Their emotional world is built on something deeper than temporary reactions. And this allows the avoidant person to relax emotionally. For perhaps the first time, they experience a connection where love does not feel consuming. It does not feel like pressure. It does not feel like losing freedom. It feels peaceful. That peace slowly awakens something inside them they have often buried for years. The desire to truly connect, not because they were forced, but because your patience gave them room to breathe. Your emotional strength made them feel safe, and your purpose showed them that healthy love can exist without emotional control. This combination is incredibly rare. Most people either become emotionally detached or emotionally dependent. But emotionally mature people learn how to remain loving while still staying grounded within themselves. That balance transforms relationships because emotionally avoidant people are not searching for perfection. Deep down, they are searching for someone whose presence feels emotionally safe enough for them to stop running, someone patient enough not to force them, someone strong enough not to be destroyed by temporary emotional distance, someone purposeful enough not to lose themselves inside the relationship. And when they finally experience that kind of connection, something extraordinary happens. The walls they spent years building slowly begin coming down. Fear starts losing power. Trust begins growing naturally. And love, perhaps for the first time in a very long time, starts feeling safe instead of dangerous.